have the pleasure of introducing Professor Bob Jessop, distinguished theorist of capitalism, of crisis, and of cultural political economy. Professor Jessop, could you expand on the distinction that you make between crisis of neoliberalism and crisis in neoliberalism, and why is this distinction important for understanding the financial crisis?
Okay, let me start by first distinguishing between crisis in and crisis of in general terms. My argument is that crises are recurrent features, necessary features of capital accumulation. There's nothing surprising about crisis. It's a mechanism in and through which capital accumulation renews itself. Because crises are recurrent or regular features of capitalism, over time, through trial and error experimentation, ways of managing crises, routines of crisis management have developed, and they vary by the accumulation regime, the mode of regulation. So a crisis of is when established crisis management routines break down. And so the distinction between crisis in and crisis of is whether one can manage this crisis through established routines, or they pose a basic challenge to the ability to go on through renewal for capital accumulation. The distinction then in terms of neoliberalism is whether a neoliberal regime of accumulation, which is primarily linked with finance-dominated accumulation, when it enters into crisis, has the means, the mechanisms to overcome a crisis, or whether neoliberalism is thrown into crisis. And the issue then is whether there are already established routines for managing a crisis in neoliberalism or not. One example of an established routine is the return to budget, or the discovery of Minsky's moment, and so forth. But more generally, the problem is that the magnitude of the crisis of neoliberalism on a global scale, because of hyperfinancialization, which takes us well beyond anything that Bagehot might have envisaged, poses major problems for the regeneration of capital accumulation in a neoliberal context. That then depends on the balance of forces. And we had the Tea Party, we had Occupy. Occupy was repressed very, very quickly through paramilitary police forces coordinated on an American-wide scale, and they were rolled back, especially when they were presented as a narrow middle-class group rather than a group representing the 99%. The Tea Party was given its head until very recently, when it threatened a crisis in the financial system and a crisis of the state. But by buying time, it was possible for a rassemblement, a reorganization of the political and financial, the economic elites to recover what had been a crisis of neoliberalism and turn it back into a crisis in neoliberalism, because they worked out the routines now that can be spread more generally, how you deal with a crisis of finance-dominated accumulation in a neoliberal context.
Okay, thank you. And is this movement from off to in, is it linked to your concept of hyperfinancialization?
It is linked to my concept of hyperfinancialization, which is not just a question of the increasing importance of financial capital, but the increasing importance of increasingly fictitious and fantastic forms of fictitious commodities, fictitious credit, fictitious capital, and fictitious debt, especially derivatives. And it's the increasing rarefication of financial instruments, of credit, of capital, and so forth, that makes it more difficult because of leverage, because of the increasing disproportion between the growth in the real, in quotation marks, economy and the amount of debt, fictitious credit floating in the system. That's what I mean by hyperfinancialization. It goes well beyond anything that is functionally appropriate to the capitalist economy. Andrew Haldane in the Bank of England put this very well. Normal banking is financial intermediation and risk management. Hyperfinancialization is financial speculation and risk-taking. And it's the growth of that which I would call hyper-financialization.
Excellent. Actually, he was discussing this idea of global banks as super spreaders of systemic risk. I don't know if you saw, and putting an institutional context and perspective onto that hyper-financialization. So it's quite a useful term to think about institutions there. And the last one, this idea of your concept of variegated capitalism and the link to financialization. So we were thinking here in the project about financialization and how to approach it in different
Yes, I mean, some people in the FESSUD project talk about variegated financialization. I want to put that into the context of variegated capitalism. And in brief, my notion of variegated capitalism is a middle way between the idea that there is a logic of the world system which pre-exists and is an inherent characteristic of the world system, and the idea that there are just so many varieties, national varieties of capitalism. My argument is national varieties of capitalism interact within the framework of an increasingly integrated world market. One of the crucial mechanisms of world market integration is financialization and hyper-financialization, and indeed neoliberalization, which frees up capital to move with minimum frictions around the world. And the easiest fraction of capital to move around the world is super-fast, hypermobile financial capital. But I would understand, for me, variegated financialization has to be located within the broader dynamic, emerging dynamic of a world market with its variegated capitalist features. But in terms of crisis generation, financialization and hyper-financialization now are much more generative of crisis tendencies at a global scale, especially through contagion, than industrial capital or profit-producing capital is ever able to manage, because it's much more tied to specific times and places, whereas hyper-financialized, super-mobile, super-fast financial capital moves so quickly and is so highly leveraged. Its damage when there is a crisis is much greater than any particular industrial sector could generate.
What's your expectation for the future?
Well, my expectation for the future is, until there is a long-term war of position comparable to that of the neoliberals from the 1930s through to the 1970s, capable of renewing itself, the neoliberal forces will always outmaneuver at a global and macro level what the left can do. So until there is a comparable and more bottom-up movement connecting different alternative economic projects, environmental projects, local financial projects and so forth, with lesson sharing and consolidating a bottom-up movement, the crisis of neoliberalism will always be recuperated. And if you remember in my presentation, I referred to Paul Deutsch's definition of power as the ability not to have to learn from your mistakes. So until there's a sufficiently wide-ranging counter-hegemonic movement to force elites to learn from their mistakes, crises of neoliberalism, which I expect to recur, will be transferred through a war of maneuver into crises in neoliberalism. And neoliberalism is a utopian project on the one hand, or it's a process that renews itself continually through crisis, through fuite en avant. So crises of neoliberalism are the means to renew neoliberalism.